Yo guys, it's Bella and welcome back to my channel. So today we're going to be doing another Mystery Monday. Today we're going to be doing another Australian case. I get so many requests for Australian cases all the time. You guys seem to find them really interesting, so do let me know if you want to see more of them. My last case, the Claremont serial killer, I'll link that below. That was an Australian case as well. And a lot of messed up stuff happens here in Australia. So honestly, there's no shortage of cases if that is what you guys are interested in. But yeah, let's go ahead and get into today's case. Today, we're going to be talking about the murder of Peter Falconio and the attempted abduction of Joanne, which happened in Barrow Creek in Northern Territory. And this was a pretty huge case in Australia. If you've seen Wolf Creek, this case reminded me a lot of that. So I did a little bit of looking into that as well. And if you guys have seen Wolf Creek, you know that it was based on true events. So it wasn't actually based on like a singular case. The person who made the movie took inspiration from, I feel like that's a weird word to say considering their murders, but they took inspiration from a bunch of incidents and crimes that happen in outback Australia to make the movie, and this was one of them. So there's a lot of similarities, and actually when the movie was released, it had to be delayed for like 2 years before it could be released in the Northern Territory because of this case. So anyway, if you guys don't know a lot about the Northern Territory, it is obviously an Australian territory. It is in central and central North Australia, and it is not very populated. There's only 250,000 people in the whole of the territory, and it's big. It covers 1.3 million kilometers of land and literally has less people than Tasmania, which is the tiny little dot at the base of Australia, because it is just one of the driest, most inhospitable places in the world, and it's one of the least populated places in the world for that reason. It is also home to Uluru, or Ayers Rock, if you guys have heard of that, and that is a very, very popular tourist destination. It brings like 100,000 tourists every year. The closest town to it is called Alice Springs, and Alice Springs is where most people will go, and then they'll hire a car or a van or something to make the drive to Uluru. I think it's like a 400-kilometer drive, so it takes about 6 hours, I think. And then there's a campsite that's like 20 kilometers away from it that people will normally drive to and stay there from Alice Springs. So it's a really desolate area. There's not a lot of service out there, not a lot of fuel on that drive as well. So when you do go to hire like a van or a car or anything from Alice Springs to make the drive, they give you like this whole guidebook with a bunch of advice and tips and tricks and what to be aware of and stuff like that. Obviously, there's nothing out there, so they tell you to stock up on all of your supplies. They also tell you to be aware of road trains. If you guys have heard of them, they are these massive, massive trucks. They're like 50 meters long, and the people driving them, because they're driving for just such long stretches of road and there's not a lot on these roads, they drive at really, really high speed. So you really do have to be careful of them. You also have to be careful of wildlife, because there's a lot of that, and kangaroos are really stupid, especially when it starts getting to about dawn and past dawn when it's dark. Kangaroos will sit on the side of the road until they see your car, and then they will just jump in front of your car, and then there's nothing out there, hardly any service, so you are just up shit creek without a paddle, basically. So yeah, the guidebook tries to tell you all about that, tries to make you aware and make sure that you are safe. So anyway, two tourists that did want to make this trip were Peter Falconio and Joanne Leese. And Peter was born on the 20th September in 1972 in Hepworth, which was like a small village in West Yorkshire, which was in, I think it's called Huddersfield in England. He was the second of Joan and Luciano's 4 children, and he was friends with all of his brothers, Nicholas, Paul, and Mark. He was a really smart kid and a bit of a class clown, which is how he made a lot of his friends. He was quite popular in school. He went on to study building construction while working part-time at a bowling alley and also at a nightclub to get him through school. And then after graduating, he got himself a job as a surveyor and bought himself a small cottage pretty close to his parents' house. He met Joanne in 1996 while they were both out at a nightclub, and ever since they met, they were just inseparable. Joanne was born on the 25th of September in 1973, and she lived with her mum because her parents were divorced, and her mum eventually moved on and met her stepdad Vincent, and they had a child together. So Joanne's half brother Sam, and they didn't have a lot of money, so it was kind of a struggle for Jenny to provide for her children, but she did the best that she could to make sure that they got everything that they deserved. Oftentimes Joanne would walk in on her crying with a bunch of bills in front of her, so it was pretty overwhelming, but she seemed to have a good childhood anyway. Joanne and her family also lived in Huddersfield in England, and she was a happy girl, but she was very quiet and very shy. While she was in college, she worked as a barmaid, and occasionally she would fill in at a factory working as a bacon packer to put herself through college as well. And then when she finished college, she got a job at Thomas Cook, which was a travel agent. So while they were together, Peter really wanted to kind of climb up the ladder and chase success, I guess, and he thought he'd have more ease doing that if he had a degree. So he moved to Northampton to study for his degree, and then he ended up moving to Brighton and going to Brighton University. Joanne decided to stay in Huddersfield, so they were doing long distance for a while. I think Brighton and Huddersfield were about 400 kilometers away from each other, because Joanne's mum was quite ill with arthritis, so she wanted to stay and she wanted to help her. But her mum was actually getting more independent because of her stepdad, Vincent. She had someone there to look after her. So when Peter eventually did ask Joanne to move with him to Brighton, she did it. She got a transfer with Thomas Cook and was working in 2 different Thomas Cook offices in Brighton. And they both were super ambitious and wanted to travel, and Joanne worked at Thomas Cook, which obviously working at a travel agent would just make you want to explore the world. They did a few short trips together. I think they went to Italy, Greece, Jamaica, but they just wanted to go further and they wanted to explore the world. So in 1998, they started planning a massive trip that they were going to go on together. They planned on spending most of their time in Australia, which made their parents quite nervous because there was a lot of scary things happening in Australia at the time. In the early 90s, 7 backpackers, 5 of which were foreign tourists, were murdered in the Belanglo State Forest, which you guys may have heard of. It was known as the Backpacker Murders. Ivan Milat was the serial killer behind that. Also in 1996, we had the Port Arthur massacre. So 35 people were killed there, 23 were injured by a lone gunman, and that, actually, fun fact, is when Australia basically transformed their gun legislation, and we have never had a mass shooting since. But anyway, that's not what this video is about. Also in 2000, so just a few months before Peter and Joanne were going to leave on their trip, there was another incident in Queensland where 15 tourists, 7 of which were British tourists, actually died because this crazy guy who just for some reason hated backpackers set fire to the Childers Palace backpacker hostel. So yeah, understandably their parents were pretty worried about their trip, but they just told each other to make sure that they never hitchhiked and to take really good care of each other. Originally they were going to go in the summer of 2000, so I think it was the English summer that they were planning on going in. But Peter got an offer to finish this college project he'd been working on, and so they decided to postpone the trip a few months, which actually made the trip that much more appealing because in those few months was actually the wettest England had ever had on record. It was just raining cats and dogs, and they were going to be going into the Australian summer. So yeah, they were very, very keen to get out of that. They left for their trip on the 15th of November in 2000 and started started their trip in Nepal. So it was a huge trip. They were going to go to a bunch of different places starting in Nepal. They then went from Singapore to Malaysia to Thailand. They were going to go to Bangkok, but then they decided to change their plans last minute and go to Cambodia instead, which ended up not being the best idea for them, because when they got there, it was literally just on their second day there, they realized that somebody had stolen their return flight tickets, and also Joanne had lost or forgotten her traveler's check. They didn't really have a lot of money either. It was a pretty scary time for them. They reported it to police, but there was nothing really they could do. Luckily, there was another backpacker who was kind enough to pay for their flights to Bangkok, and when they got to Bangkok, they managed to get back on their feet and sort themselves out. And then on the 26th of January in 2001, they flew to Australia and landed in Sydney. They got a flat together in Bondi, which they were just going to use as a base, because they were planning on staying in Sydney for 3 months originally. And then they were going to go and get jobs, because they were there on a working traveler's visa. So I think they couldn't work at a place for any more than 6 months. So it kind of made it a little bit of an issue to get any of the jobs in their line of work. So Joanne ended up getting a job at Dimmicks, which is a big bookstore here. I don't know if you guys have it overseas, you probably do, and I probably sound really dumb. Anyway, Peter ended up getting a job installing furniture around Sydney. So they just got little odd jobs because, you know, employers didn't want to hire people that they were just going to have to let go in 6 months anyway. But either way, they made a lot of friends. They had a ball in Sydney. Joanne especially got on really, really well with her co-workers. So every single Thursday, they would go to a place called the Cooper's Arms Hotel. They would get drunk. I think Joanne ended up trying ecstasy. Like, she was just having a time of her life there. And then after, they would go to the Cooper's Arms Hotel every Thursday. They would then go to a co-worker's hotel. Everyone would sleep there, and then they would go to work the next morning. And then every single Friday as well, her and all of her friends would go to the St. Patrick's Tavern. So yeah, she made some really, really good close friends while they were there. Peter, on the other hand, wasn't really interested. He was more interested in traveling and planning where they were going to go next and what to do next and how to get to the next place. And Joanne was just having such a good time that originally they were meant to stay there for 3 months, but she ended up prolonging their stay in Sydney for 5 months. So eventually, when they were ready to move on, they were going to get a car and they were going to head to Melbourne, then to Adelaide, then to Darwin, then to Brisbane, where they were going to sell the car and then fly over to New Zealand. So Peter went to this place called the Travellers Car Market, which is literally what the name suggests. It's where travellers went to buy and sell their cars that they used to travel around Australia. And it was held in an underground car park in King's Cross, and he ended up finding this orange combi van, which was like 30 years old or something, I think, but had only 136,000 miles or kilometers on it, which is insane for a car that is 30 years old. But it was in pretty good condition, just had a new paint job. It had everything that they would need for a long haul trip. It had a fridge, it had a bed with like curtains to go over the window. It had a sink, it even had a gas stove cooktop. It didn't go over 80 kilometers an hour, but the owners that had just used it to go around Australia themselves said that it ran really well and they didn't have any issues with it. They were selling it for $3,000, but Peter managed to get it down to $1,800 and bought it. He was so excited when he bought it, and when he told Joanne, she just got really excited for the next leg of their trip, and he was doing all these little modifications to it, like he added lamps, he added a safety deposit box so that they wouldn't have another like Cambodia incident. Then they began the next part of their trip on June 25th in 2001, where they headed to Canberra, then to Melbourne, and then to Adelaide. Adelaide was pretty slow. They really liked it there. They visited Glenelg Beach while they were there, which if you guys remember when I did the Beaumont children case, that is the beach that they disappeared from. They then drove through the Barossa Valley. They also drove through Snowtown, which is where another series of murders took place that I'm hoping to do a video on very soon. afternoon. They were just about to start on the Stuart highway, which is just this massive highway that goes all the way through the middle of Australia, all the way from Darwin to South Australia, and it is literally 2,834 kilometers long, so it's massive. There's only 17 junctions in the whole thing, even though it is that long, because it's just like this straight highway through the middle of Australia, like just through the desert basically. And it's so desolate that you can go for days on end driving on this highway without seeing a single other person. But it's mostly used for transporting goods, and there's a lot of those infamous road trains on the highway because it just, you know, gets you from one side to the other. So from where they were, it was about a 17-hour drive to Uluru, which is where they were headed. They briefly stopped in Port Augusta to get some supplies before heading to Cuba Pedy, which, if you guys haven't heard of it, it's the opal capital of the world actually, and it's so small. There's only like 1,700 people there, and if you guys haven't like seen it, I would definitely recommend looking it up, because what I find cool about it is that it gets really hot there, so all of the residents and even the hotels and stuff are actually in caves, because inside the caves it stays a constant cool temperature without air conditioning, and they're like full houses, but they're just in caves. Now, at around this time, there were 3 other British tourists as well that were also doing a tour of Australia. They were about 1,500 kilometers away from Alice Springs, heading towards Mount Isa. There was 2 girls who were in the front. They actually had a combi as well. 2 girls were in the front and 1 guy in the back who was lying down, so he was out of view. Now, while they were driving, they saw in their rear vision mirror a white 4-wheel drive ute with a green canopy over the ute. And at first they were pretty excited because, like I said, you can go days on end without seeing other cars. So seeing another car, you're like, hello, it's another human being. But then this person sped up, got really, really close to them, and was just kind of tailing them for a very long time, which was freaking them out a little bit. And then finally this person like went next to them as if to overtake, but then just matched their speed and kind of drove directly next to them. While he was next to them, he was just staring at them, which really creeped them out, before he just drove away. They thought the whole experience was super weird, and then a little bit up the road, they saw a car pulled over. It was the same car. There was a guy standing outside next to the car smoking a cigarette, and they drove past him, and as soon as they drove past him, he got back in his car, sped up, caught all the way up to them, and did the same thing again. He was just tailing them for ages before getting next to them and then matching their speed and driving next to them again. This time, when they looked at him, he was making all these weird gestures, and then he put 2 of his fingers up to his head and made like a shooting motion, until their male friend in the back kind of got up, looked out the window. The guy saw him, and as soon as he saw the guy, he just drove away. So yeah, the whole thing was pretty weird, to the point where they were actually going to report it to the Mount Isa police when they got there, but they didn't end up doing that for another 3 weeks. So anyway, Peter and Joanne made it to Cuba Pedy. They loved it. They thought it was nothing like they'd ever seen before. Joanne sent her mum a postcard, because every major destination they went to, they sent their parents a postcard. They were very, very good at keeping in contact with their families back home. So then they carried on their way to the Yulara campground, which is the closest campground to Uluru. It's 20 kilometers away. They got there in time to shower, eat, and then get in bed for an early night, because the next day they wanted to do the dawn walking hike tour of Uluru so that they could see the sunrise and stuff like that. And speaking of the Yulara campground, actually, if you guys have heard of the Dingo Ate My Baby case, that is where that happened. So that's a pretty interesting case as well. If you guys want me to do a video on that, please let me know. Australia just has so many bizarre cases. So anyway, the next day they went on their climbing walk tour. They got a photo. They thought it was so beautiful, really enjoyed it. They then went on to hike Olga's on July 11th, which is where they met 2 other backpackers called Mark and Isabel, and they were Canadian. They both discovered that they like basically had the same trip planned, or well, the next 2 stops, they were going to go to Kings Canyon and then to Alice Springs. So Joanne and Peter said, you know what, why don't you guys come with us, and we're planning on going to Kings Canyon as well, and then we'll drop you at Alice Springs. So they got into Alice Springs, and it was their last major stop before they went to Darwin. So they were really trying to soak up the utilities and having a proper base, having a place to have an actual shower, actual food, stuff like that before they headed on their way again. They dropped Mark and Isabel off, and then went and dropped the combi off at a mechanic because it was kind of veering off to one side, and the mechanic said, no worries, I'll have this to you by Friday morning, so come and get it then. And then they headed to a caravan park, which is where they were going to be staying for the next few days in Alice Springs. They called their parents while there, told them everything was great. They told them that there was a couple who said that they have to see this thing called the Camel Cup while they were there, which was this thing that happened like once a year, every year. And they also had like a Camel Cup beauty pageant, and it just so happened that it was going to be happening the very next day, just while they were there. So it was pretty lucky timing, and it was kind of in the afternoon. They weren't planning on staying as late as the Camel Cup went, but how could they miss it? So on Saturday the 14th, Peter went to go and pick up the combi. He then went to an accountant who told him that he actually owed the tax office money because when he was in Sydney and he was working, he was paying tax as an Australian resident rather than as a non-resident. So he owed like a little bit of money to the tax office or something. Joanne was at the library checking her emails while he did that, and then they met up at around 10:30 to go and get some breakfast. Then after brekkie, Joanne called her friend Amanda and told her that everything was going well, and she told her that they were going to go and see the Camel Cup. And then after they left Alice Springs after the Camel Cup, like the whole reason they didn't want to leave at around the time of the Camel Cup is because they didn't want to drive when it got dark, and they had like a 6-hour drive to Darwin. So their plan after the Camel Cup was they were going to go to Darwin, and then from Darwin, Peter was going to fly to Papua New Guinea while Joanne was going to go fly back to Sydney to see her friends. Then they were going to go and meet in Brisbane and then fly to New Zealand together. And in New Zealand, actually, they were going to meet her friend Amanda, who she was just on the phone to. So after Joanne got off the phone, they went to a travel agent to book Joanne her flights, and then they headed to the Camel Cup, and they had a really good time there. They actually lost track of time while they were there and didn't realize until about 3 p.m. and then they were like, shit, we better get going. So they quickly went back to the caravan park to shower and, get their stuff in order before they left. And then they quickly stopped at Red Rooster before hitting the road. And like I said, it was a 6-hour drive, so they were going to take it in shifts. Joanne was going to drive for 3 hours, and Peter was going to drive for 3 hours as well, with Joanne starting the first 3 hours. So the place that they were trying to get to wasn't actually Darwin. Did I say it was Darwin? I feel like I did, but they were trying to get to a place called Devil's Marbles, also known as Kalu Kalu. It was about 400 kilometers away, so about 6 hours. So they wanted to see the sunrise there, but they weren't sure if they were going to make it because obviously driving at nighttime is very scary in the outback with all the animals and the road trains and a lot of different things. So they were just going to say, if we make it, we make it. If we don't, and if we get too scared or if we get too tired, we're just going to pull over and we're just going to sleep on the side of the road. It's fine. Peter was really tired, so while Joanne was taking her driving shift, he hopped in the back of the combi and had a nap. Then at around 6 p.m, they got to the Tire Tree Hotel, so it was about 3 hours into the drive, about halfway through the entirety of their drive, and Joanne decided to pull over, let Peter take over. They had a joint together before going into the roadhouse and getting supplies at 6:21, which is what the receipt from the roadhouse said. And then Peter took over driving the rest of the way. At around 7:30, they just passed the Barrow Creek Roadhouse. So at around 7:30, they passed the Barrow Creek Roadhouse, and as they did, they saw some headlights in their rear vision mirror, which, they hadn't really seen any people up until this point. And the headlights started getting closer to the point that they were really bright and Peter couldn't see anything. Joanne turned around to have a look and she could not see anything but the lights. They were blinding and they were really, really close to the car because this guy started tailing them. So Peter was complaining because of how bright they were, and then eventually this guy got in the lane next to them and then matched their speed, just like with the 3 tourists I told you guys about earlier. He just drove alongside them, and then when Peter and Joanne looked over, they saw this guy making all sorts of different facial expressions and doing different things with his hands, and eventually he put the window down and started yelling out to them, and the only word they could make out was exhaust. So they decided to pull over. This person was driving a white four-wheel drive ute with a green canvas canopy, and he pulled over behind their car as well. And Peter got out to go and have a look. Joanne was pretty scared. She didn't like the look of the guy. She told Peter to be safe. Peter left his car door open and told her to stay in the car while he went out to have a look at what was going on. So Joanne stayed where she was. She stayed in the car. She obviously turned back to try and hear and see what was going on. She saw Peter bend down to have a look at the exhaust, and then heard the guy get out and say, I saw sparks coming from your exhaust for a long time, which kind of relieved her, because she was like, okay, you know, they're nice. Like, she was pretty worried, and she's like, it's fine. It's just someone who's actually trying to help us out. So Peter came back to the car, grabbed some cigarettes, and asked Joanne to rev the engine once he got to the back so that he could see what was going on. So he went back around to the back of the car. She turned the engine on, started revving it. She heard a bang, which she thought was just the engine backfiring. So she turned around to see what was going on, and then the next thing she knew, the man from the four-wheel drive had come around and had put a gun to her head through the window. He then opened the door. He was yelling at her to turn the car off, but she was obviously in shock at this point. She was just fumbling. So he ended up shoving her over to the passenger side of the door. He got in the car and turned it off himself. And then he started yelling at her, saying for her to put her head down and put her arms behind her back. But she was just in shock. She didn't know what to do. She was just sitting there, like, not even understanding what was going on right at that point. So he started yelling at her again, telling her to put her head down and put her arms behind her back. And then he started yelling and he was screaming, and he put a gun to her head, and then pushed her head down into the seat, and she put her arms behind her back. Then as she did that, he started tying these like handmade handcuffs to her that were made with cable ties and electrical tape, and then he shoved her out of the car onto the ground and stood on top of her. He was trying to like tie her ankles with the same kind of handmade home cuffs, but she was kicking, she was screaming. Eventually he just gave up, and then he tried to electrical tape her mouth as well. But again, she was kicking, she was screaming. He missed, he got it in her hair instead. He then dragged her around to the back of the ute, took the canvas canopy, just the corner off of his ute, and grabbed like a cloth bag out of it, which he put on her head. Then he took her around to his passenger side door and shoved her in the back seat of the ute. When he shoved her in there, she saw that he actually had a dog, and this dog was just totally unfazed by everything that was going on. It was sitting in the front seat, and just, it was like nothing was happening. The car interior light was also on, so she got a good look at the man's face, because he was like right up in her face. He was scruffy, he was a little older with grey specks through his beard, and he had like a very long face. And this whole time she's just like kicking and she's screaming and she's yelling for Peter, because she hadn't seen Peter since he went back around and asked her to rev the car. So she didn't know where he was, what had happened to him, if he was even still alive. She just didn't know. She hadn't seen him. And then the next thing she knew, she was in the tray of his ute under the green canvas canopy, and she didn't know how she even got there. He put her in there on her stomach, but she managed to roll around onto her back, and she could hear the guy walking around. So she started screaming and asking where Peter was, and he just yelled at her and told her to shut up and threatened to shoot her if she didn't shut up. But she didn't stop. She started asking him questions. She started saying, are you going to rape me? Is it money you want? Do you want the car? Just take it all. Did you shoot Peter? And he just replied, no. Eventually, after a while, she didn't hear any footsteps anymore. So I guess the back tray must have been down or something, and she managed to slip out, and she just ran into the shrubs, just ran. And it was like the way that I listened to it, all I could think of was like a movie, because she fell over twice. And you know, in movies when that happens and you just go, get up, they're gonna get you, like, get up, you have to run. So she fell over twice. She just kept running and running and running until she physically just could not run anymore. And then she hid in this big like shrub bush and curled up underneath it. Then after a little while, she heard the man and his dog come over to look for her. She could see his flashlight looking for her, and he walked past her like 3 times, I think it was, and somehow he didn't see her. So eventually he started walking away. She heard him slam his car door, turn the car on, and then she thought that he was going to drive away, but instead he just faced the car towards her so that the headlights were facing where she was, I guess trying to look for her. And then eventually he just left. So she was obviously terrified. She stayed in the bush for ages. At one point she heard a car driving past, which she thought was him coming back to get her, but it was actually just a local family. They were driving south, and the reason that they were on the road so late is because they had a flat tire. So they had to fix that up, and they were a bit behind schedule. And this family actually saw the white four-wheel drive past them, and then a little further up the road they saw the orange combi, but they didn't really think too much of it, and they just kept driving. So while Joanne was lying there, she was trying to get the handcuffs off, but she couldn't. She was doing everything in her power. Eventually she managed to get them from the back of her to the front of her, and the way she described it was she curled her legs up into a tight little ball and then got her arms around her legs one at a time, and then managed to get them to the front of her. But she couldn't break them. She couldn't get them off. She tried to get her chapstick from her pocket and grease up her wrist, but nothing worked. She just couldn't get them off. She stayed out there in that shrub for 5 hours, which is just insane because it was about 11 degrees Celsius. She only had a shirt and shorts on, so she must have been freezing. She would have been terrified. It would have just been the scariest thing in the world. I cannot even imagine. And then eventually, about 5 hours after the whole ordeal, she crawled out to the side of the road and then was hiding in like this long grass on the side of the road until eventually she saw some headlights, and they were the headlights of a road train. So she ran out onto the road, stood right in front of where the road train was coming, and just held up her handcuffs. And then right before the road train got to her, she jumped off of the road and ran alongside the road train. And these things are huge. So it took 1 kilometer for the truck to be able to stop. And originally the truck driver, his name was Vincent Miller, he thought that he had run her over until he saw her just like running up to him, sobbing hysterically.